The silence that followed his father's funeral was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the peaceful hush of a prairie evening or the reverent stillness of an empty church. It was a thick, suffocating blanket, woven from unspoken words, and the heavy dust of a life suddenly ended. Silas Whitmore felt it in his bones, a hollow ache that echoed the newly dug grave on the hill. The ranch, once a sprawling testament to his father's unyielding labor, now felt like a tomb, vast and airless. Every creak of the floorboards in the empty house was a phantom footstep, every gust of wind a mournful sigh. He moved through the rooms his father had built, touching the worn leather of his armchair, smelling the faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco and earth, and found no comfort, only a profound and bewildering vacancy. His grief was a raw, open wound, but beneath it, something else festered, a deep gnawing unease that had little to do with death and everything to do with the living. The source of this disturbance stood stubbornly in the side yard, a creature of singular, infuriating purpose. Pete, the old burro his father had doted on, had become a sentinel. For 3 days, since they'd returned from burying Thomas Whitmore, the animal had not moved from his post in front of the green cellar door. He stood stock still, a dusty, gray statue of defiance, his long ears occasionally twitching at a fly, his dark, liquid eyes fixed on the weathered wood, as if expecting it to part like the Red Sea. Silas had tried everything. He'd offered fresh oats, crisp apples, even a bucket of cool well water. He'd tugged on the burro's halter, his voice starting as a gentle coaxing and escalating to a frustrated roar that cracked in the oppressive quiet. Pete would not budge. He planted his hooves, lowered his head, and became an immovable object, a furry anchor tethered to a secret. It was more than stubbornness. Silas knew the animal. Pete was loyal to a fault, but his loyalty had always been directed at Thomas. Now, with Thomas gone, that fierce devotion had been transferred to a slab of wood and iron. It was unnatural. It felt significant, and it was starting to fray Silas's already ragged nerves. The cellar door itself was an object of mundane mystery. Set at a slant against the stone foundation of the house, it was painted a deep forest green, now faded and peeling after decades under the relentless sun and biting winter winds. 3 ancient, oversized locks, monuments of rust-red iron, secured it. They were relics. In all his 29 years, Silas had never once seen that door opened. His father had always been vague, dismissive. Root cellar, he'd grumble if asked. But the damp got in years back. Ruined the whole lot. Nothing down there now but spiders and bad memories. Silas had accepted the explanation without question. It was just another part of the ranch's geography, as unremarkable as the leaning fence post by the north pasture or the lightning-scarred oak on the ridge. But now, with Pete standing his solemn, inexplicable vigil, the door seemed different. It loomed in his perception, no longer a simple cellar entrance but a forbidden threshold, an ancient tomb sealed against the world. The peeling paint looked like a diseased skin, and the 3 locks seemed less like security and more like a trinity of warnings. His father's casual dismissal now rang false, a hastily constructed wall around a topic he didn't wish to broach. What bad memories? What could possibly be down there that required 3 locks and the undying vigilance of a heartbroken burro? On the 4th evening, as a bruised purple twilight settled over the plains, Silas stood on the porch, a cup of bitter coffee growing cold in his hand, and watched the standoff. Pete hadn't eaten, hadn't taken water. His loyalty was turning into a death wish. A wave of anger, hot and sharp, washed over Silas. Anger at the burro's foolishness, at his father for leaving behind this tangled knot of questions, at the crushing weight of the silence. He slammed the cup down on the railing, the ceramic cracking with a sharp report. He would break this impasse. He would move the animal, board up the damn door, and try to find some semblance of normalcy in the wreckage of his life. He strode across the dusty yard, his boots kicking up small puffs of dirt. "All right, you old fool," he muttered. grabbing the leather halter. "This ends now." He pulled, putting his shoulder and all his grief-fueled strength into the effort. Pete strained against him, muscles quivering, a low, guttural groan rumbling in his chest. It wasn't the sound of an animal resisting. It was the sound of an animal in agony, torn between two loyalties. And then Silas saw it. A tremor ran through the burro's body, his ears flattened against his skull, and his eyes, wide with what looked like mortal terror, were locked on the door. He wasn't just guarding it. He was terrified of what would happen if he failed. The realization stopped Silas cold. His anger evaporated, replaced by a chilling dread. He let go of the halter. Pete sagged, his breathing heavy and ragged, but he did not move from his spot. Silas looked from the distressed animal to the impassive green door, and the world tilted on its axis. The quiet of the ranch was no longer empty. It was listening, waiting, and something was waiting with it, right there, on the other side of that wood. The days that followed blurred into a haze of routine chores performed on autopilot. Silas mended fences, fed the stock, and moved through his father's house like a ghost, but his mind was tethered to the drama unfolding in the side yard. Pete grew thinner, his ribs beginning to show beneath his dusty coat. He accepted small sips of water when Silas brought the bucket directly to his mouth, but he refused all food, his gaze never wavering from the cellar door. The burro's silent suffering was a constant screaming accusation. Every time Silas looked at him, he felt a fresh stab of guilt and a deepening of the mystery that was now the central feature of his existence. The ranch, his home, the only world he had ever known, suddenly felt alien, a landscape of secrets hidden in plain sight. He began to study the door, trying to decipher its meaning. He ran his fingers over the blistered paint and the cold, pitted iron of the locks. They were immense, far more robust than necessary for a simple root cellar. They were the kind of locks one used for a jail or a powder magazine. Why? The question echoed in the hollow spaces of the house, in the rustle of the wind through the tall prairie grass, in the mournful, low bray Pete would sometimes let out in the dead of night. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the relentless questions and the oppressive sun, Silas retreated into his father's study. The room was the heart of the ranch, a place of ledgers, maps, and the quiet scent of old paper and leather. It was the one place where Thomas Whitmore's presence felt tangible, comforting. Silas ran a hand along the spines of the books on the shelf, treatises on animal husbandry, almanacs, histories of the West, a few worn volumes of poetry. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a connection, a moment of respite. He pulled out a thick, unassuming book titled Principles of Crop Rotation. It was a dry, practical text, the sort of thing his father would read, not for pleasure, but for duty. It felt heavier than it should. He opened it, and the pages fell away to reveal a neat, rectangular hollow carved into their center. Nestled inside, gleaming dully against the yellowed paper, was a key. It was unlike any key Silas had ever seen. It was made of heavy, dark iron, with a single thick shaft that terminated not in one set of teeth, but 3. Each set was uniquely shaped, a complex piece of metal engineering designed to defeat a series of corresponding wards. 3 sets of teeth for 3 locks. His breath caught in his chest. His father, a man of simple habits and transparent honesty, had a secret so profound he had hidden its only key inside a book about the cycles of the earth, a metaphor so stark it felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about bad memories and spiders. This was a deliberate, calculated, and lifelong act of concealment. He closed the book, the key heavy and cold in his palm. It felt like a verdict. The air in the study grew thin, charged with electricity. The silence was no longer waiting. It was screaming. He walked out of the house, the key clutched in his fist, his heart hammering against his ribs. The world seemed to shrink, focusing down to a single point, the green door. As he approached, Pete's demeanor shifted from stoic vigilance to frantic alarm. The burro began to pace in a tight, agitated circle, bumping against Silas's legs, letting out a series of sharp, panicked brays. It was a sound of pure protest, a desperate plea. "Easy, boy," Silas whispered, his voice unsteady. "Easy now. We have to know." The cries of the animal were a physical force, pushing against him, but the weight of the key in his hand pulled him forward. He knelt before the first lock, the topmost one. The rust was thick, like a scab. He inserted the key, feeling the first set of teeth engage the inner mechanism. Pete's cries grew more intense, more mournful, a keening wail that seemed to tear at the fabric of the afternoon. With a great effort, Silas turned the key. There was a hideous, groaning screech of metal on metal, a sound of violation, and with a loud clang, the locking bar shot back. 1. He moved to the second lock, the one in the middle. His hands were slick with sweat. Pete was now nudging his shoulder with his head, a frantic, desperate gesture. "Don't do this. Stop. Please, stop." Silas ignored him, his focus absolute. He fitted the key into the second lock. This one was stiffer. He had to put his weight into it, gritting his teeth as he turned. The internal tumblers fought back, then gave way with a sudden, jarring snap. The sound echoed in the unnerving stillness. 2. Pete let out a final, soul-shattering bray, a sound of utter defeat and despair, and then fell silent. He simply stood, head bowed, trembling. He had done all he could. Silas's hands shook as he approached the final lock, the lowest one, half buried in the encroaching dirt. He felt as though he were standing on a precipice, the solid ground of his entire life crumbling away behind him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that whatever was on the other side of this door would change everything. The world he had known, the memory of his father, his own identity. It was all about to be broken. He inserted the key a final time. He turned it. There was no loud noise this time, just a soft, metallic sigh, like a final breath being released after a long struggle. 3. He stood up, his legs unsteady. The 3 locks hung open, their purpose defeated. Pete watched him, his dark eyes filled with a sorrow so profound it felt human. Silas took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and imminent revelation. He reached down, his fingers closing around the cold iron handle. He pulled. The door, heavy and swollen with damp, resisted for a moment, and then scraped open with a low, guttural groan, releasing a blast of cool, stagnant air that smelled of damp earth, tallow, and something else, something inexplicably, impossibly alive. He peered into the darkness, his eyes struggling to adjust. A single candle flickered on a small, crude table, its tiny flame casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. And in the heart of that flickering gloom, a figure sat on a narrow cot. It was a woman. Her hair was a wild mane of gray-streaked brown, and her face was as pale as bone, but her eyes, wide and fixed on him, were a startling, familiar shade of blue. They were the eyes from the photograph on the mantelpiece, the photograph of the mother he'd been told had died in a wagon accident 27 years ago. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic beat of his own heart. Then, a voice, a dry, rasping whisper that hadn't been used for conversation in a generation, cut through the darkness. Silas? The name, his name, spoken by a ghost, shattered the world. He stumbled back, his mind reeling, unable to process the sight before him. It couldn't be. It was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by grief and stress. His mother, Ruth Whitmore, was dead. He had visited her grave every year on his birthday. His father had wept for her, had built a life on the foundation of her loss. And yet, the woman in the cellar was rising slowly from the cot, her movements stiff and uncertain, her pale face a mask of disbelief, terror, and a fragile, dawning hope. "Thomas?" she whispered, her eyes squinting against the sudden slash of daylight. Is he... Silas couldn't find his voice. He could only stare, his entire reality collapsing inward like a dying star. This was the secret. This was the bad memory. Not spiders, not damp, but a living, breathing woman. His mother, hidden away from the sun, from the world, from her own son, for nearly 3 decades. The cellar wasn't a cellar. It was a prison. It was a sanctuary. It was a lie made of stone and earth. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, descending the worn stone steps into the cold, damp air. The smell was stronger here, the scent of a life lived in confinement. There was a small shelf with a few dozen books, their spines soft with damp. A chamber pot sat discreetly in a corner. A stack of empty tin plates was piled neatly next to a water barrel. It was a life, reduced to its barest essentials. "He's gone," Silas finally managed to say, his voice thick and unfamiliar to his own ears. "We buried him 4 days ago." A sound escaped the woman's lips, a low, guttural sob of pure, unadulterated anguish. It was the sound of a world ending. She sank back onto the cot, her face in her hands, her thin shoulders shaking. And in that moment, the spectral illusion shattered, and all Silas could see was a grieving woman, a widow, his mother. He knelt in front of her, the stone floor cold against his knees. He didn't know what to do, what to say. How do you greet a mother you've never known, a mother you have mourned your entire life? He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling, and gently touched her arm. Her skin was cool, soft, real. "Mother?" The word felt alien on his tongue, a foreign syllable he had no right to speak. She looked up, tears tracking clean paths through the dust on her pale cheeks. She studied his face, her gaze tracing the lines of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. "You have his eyes," she whispered. "Thomas's eyes." She raised a trembling hand and touched his cheek, her fingers as light as a moth's wing. The contact sent a jolt through him, a current of connection that spanned 27 years of silence and separation. The reunion was not joyful. There was no cinematic rush of relief. It was a collision of sorrows, a meeting ground for 2 different yet intertwined lifetimes of loss. For the next hour, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a brilliant, mocking rectangle of light down the cellar steps, the story unfurled. It came out in fragments, in choked whispers and long, painful silences. Ruth spoke of a life before the cellar, a life Silas had only known through his father's carefully curated stories. She spoke of her love for Thomas, of their hopes for the ranch, for their infant son. And then she spoke of Caleb Hawkins. The name was a venomous spit. Hawkins was a man from a neighboring spread, a man known for his cruelty and his covetous nature. He'd made advances, which she had rebuffed. One afternoon, when Thomas was in town for supplies, Hawkins had come to the ranch. He was drunk, furious, and intent on taking what he felt he was owed. Silas listened, his fists clenching, as his mother described the assault, her voice devoid of emotion, as if reciting a story that had been told so many times in the dark it had lost all its sharp edges. She had fought back, grabbing a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. In the struggle, she had struck him, a single desperate blow to the head. He had fallen. He had not gotten back up. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered, her eyes distant, looking back across the years. "I only wanted him to stop." Thomas had returned to find her in a state of shock, kneeling beside Hawkins's body. He saw the truth in an instant, the torn dress, the terror in her eyes, the dead man on their floor. He knew the law in their corner of the world. It was a man's law. Hawkins had powerful family, and the word of a woman, especially one who had killed a man, would be worth nothing. She would be arrested. She would be tried by Hawkins's friends. She would hang. And so, in that moment of absolute crisis, Thomas Whitmore made an impossible choice. He would not sacrifice his wife to a corrupt and broken system. He would sacrifice the truth instead. He worked through the night. He buried Caleb Hawkins's body deep in the north pasture, where the soil was rocky and no one ever plowed. Then he began the great deception. He loaded a wagon with old blankets and clothes, sent Silas to stay with a neighbor for a few days, and then staged an accident, rolling the wagon into a deep ravine miles from the ranch. He returned, a broken man, telling the world his wife, Ruth, had been thrown from the wagon and her body swept away by the river. A search was conducted. Nothing was found. A memorial service was held. An empty coffin was buried on the hill. Thomas Whitmore became a widower, a single father raising a son in the shadow of tragedy. And while the world mourned her, Thomas was secretly, frantically, digging. He expanded the old root cellar, reinforcing the walls, building a ventilation shaft disguised as a chimney pipe on the far side of the house. He built a new life for her underground, a secret world beneath the world. He was her jailer and her savior, the architect of her prison and the sole guardian of her life. He brought her food and water, books and news, blankets and medicine. He would sit with her for hours in the candlelight, telling her about her son, about his first steps, his first words, the day he learned to ride a horse. He had given her a life, of a sort, at the cost of his own. He had lived a lie, every single day, for 27 years, bearing the weight of it alone, all to protect the woman he loved. The sheer scale of his father's sacrifice settled on Silas like a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. His father wasn't just a good man. He was a man of immense, almost terrifying love. A love that defied law, defied society, defied truth itself. He looked at his mother, this pale, fragile creature, who had lived in darkness for his entire conscious life, and he felt a surge of emotions so powerful they threatened to tear him apart. Rage at Caleb Hawkins, sorrow for his mother's stolen life, and a profound, aching love for the father he realized he had never truly known. "He saved me," Ruth said, her voice soft but firm. "He gave up everything so I could live, and he gave you a life free from it. He didn't want you to grow up the son of a killer." "You're not a killer," Silas said, his voice raw. "You defended yourself. The law wouldn't have seen it that way, not then, not Hawkins's people." Just then, a horse whinnied in the yard. Both of them froze. Their conversation cut short. A familiar voice called out, "Silas, you home?" It was Dr. Samuel Henley, the town physician, an old friend of his father's. Silas's mind raced. He helped his mother back into the shadows of the cellar, his heart pounding. "Stay here. Don't make a sound." He climbed the steps, pulling the heavy door almost closed, and walked into the blinding sunlight, trying to compose his face into a mask of normalcy. "Doc," he said, his voice strained. "Good to see you." Dr. Henley was a kind man with weary eyes and a gentle demeanor. He was holding his medical bag. "Just came to check on you, son, and, well, your father asked me to keep an eye on things, on the cellar." The doctor's gaze flickered towards the green door, and in that instant, Silas knew. He wasn't just a family friend. He was part of it. He was the keeper of the secret. "You knew," Silas said. It wasn't a question. The doctor's shoulders sagged. He nodded, his expression one of deep, weary resignation. "I was the one who signed the death certificate, Silas. Thomas came to me that night, told me everything. I owed him my life from the war. It was the least I could do." He looked past Silas, towards the cellar. "How is she?" The dam of composure inside Silas broke. The enormity of the conspiracy, the number of lives bent and twisted around this one terrible secret, was staggering. Before he could answer, before he could process this new revelation, his eyes caught on something tacked to the weathered wood of the barn door, something that hadn't been there that morning. It was a piece of paper, stark white against the gray wood. He walked towards it, a cold dread seeping into his bones. Dr. Henley followed, his face etched with concern. It was a wanted poster. The ink was fresh, the paper crisp. A crude drawing depicted a woman's face, a generic rendering that could have been anyone. But the name was clear, printed in bold black letters, Ruth Whitmore. And below it, the charge, wanted for the murder of Caleb Hawkins. Reward, $500. At the very bottom, a final line of text made Silas's blood run cold. Information to be directed to Jedediah Hawkins, nephew of the deceased. The danger wasn't in the past. It wasn't a ghost story confined to a cellar. The Hawkins family had never stopped looking. They had never believed the story of the wagon accident. For 27 years, they had nurtured a grudge, and now, with Thomas Whitmore's death reported in the county paper, they had renewed their hunt. The secret wasn't just a family tragedy anymore. It was a live bounty, and it was closing in. The world contracted to the size of the ranch, an isolated stage set for a play that had been decades in the making. The wanted poster was not just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war. Someone had been here. Someone had ridden onto their land, close enough to nail that notice to the barn, and then ridden away, leaving the threat to fester. Jedediah Hawkins. The name felt like a curse. A new generation carrying an old and bitter grudge. They know, Silas breathed, the words barely audible. Or they suspect. My father's death. It stirred them up. Dr. Henley's face was grim, the weariness in his eyes replaced by a sharp, focused alarm. We need to get her out of here, Silas, now. Thomas and I had a plan, for this very possibility. A cousin of mine in Oregon. It's a long ride, but— No, a soft voice said from behind them. They turned. Ruth was standing at the top of the cellar steps, blinking in the harsh sunlight, her hand shielding her eyes. She had heard everything. The sight of her, pale and spectral in the daylight, was a shock. She looked like a woman untethered from time, a ghost claiming her own haunting ground. I've been running for 27 years, Samuel. I've lived in a hole in the ground. I will not run anymore. This is my home. Her voice, though quiet, held a core of steel that Silas had never imagined. This was not the fragile, trembling woman from the cellar. This was someone else. Someone forged in darkness and silence. Someone who had reached the end of her fear. Ruth, be reasonable, the doctor pleaded. They are not reasonable men. The Hawkins clan lives on vengeance. They'll see you hang, and they'll enjoy watching. Let them try, she said. Her gaze fell on Pete, who had moved to her side, nudging her hand gently with his nose. A flicker of a sad smile touched her lips. Thomas told me about you, she whispered to the burro. My faithful guard. The air crackled with a new tension. The debate was no longer about flight. It was about fight. The ranch was no longer just a home. It was a fortress. A poorly defended, isolated fortress miles from any help. Silas felt a surge of fierce, protective loyalty that mirrored his father's. This woman, his mother, had been denied the world for his entire life. He would not let her be dragged from it now. She's right, Silas said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction. No more running. This ends here, on our land. The afternoon was spent in a flurry of desperate preparation. They were no longer just a grieving son, a reclusive doctor, and a woman who hadn't seen the sun. They were a garrison. Silas checked his father's firearms, a Winchester rifle, a double-barreled shotgun, and a Colt revolver. The ammunition was old, but he prayed it was dry. He barred the windows, wedging thick pieces of wood against the sashes. Dr. Henley, his medical bag now a trauma kit, prepared bandages and carbolic acid on the kitchen table. Ruth moved through the house with a quiet, unnerving purpose. She touched the furniture, ran her hands along the floral wallpaper in the hallway, her eyes taking in every detail of the life she had only been told about. She was reclaiming her space, not with words, but with her presence. When Silas handed her the revolver, its weight cool and solid, she didn't flinch. She took it, her slender fingers wrapping around the grip as if she'd been born to hold it. Thomas taught me how to shoot, a long time ago, she said softly. He said a woman on a ranch should know how. The irony was a bitter pill. The skills her husband taught her to protect her life in the world would now be used to defend her existence outside of her tomb. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and blood red, a palpable sense of doom settled over the ranch. Every sound was magnified. The creak of a floorboard, the whistle of the wind around the eaves, the nervous stamp of a horse in the barn. They sat in the dim light of the main room, weapons resting nearby, waiting. The silence was no longer empty or oppressive. It was coiled, a snake, ready to strike. And then it came. Not a shout, not a thundering of hooves, but a single sharp crack of a rifle shot that splintered the top of the porch railing. It was a signal, an announcement. The siege had begun. Silas dropped to the floor, pulling his mother down with him. "Get away from the windows," he hissed. Dr. Henley was already crouched behind the heavy oak dining table. A voice called out from the darkness, a rough, cruel sound that scraped against the night. "Ruth Whitmore, we know you're in there. Old man Whitmore is dead. His protection died with him. Send out the murderess, and the boy lives." Jedediah Hawkins. "Don't answer," Silas whispered, crawling towards the front window, his Winchester in his hands. He peered cautiously over the sill. He could see them, 4 shapes on horseback, silhouetted against the dying light, spread out in a semicircle around the house, just beyond the effective range of a shotgun. Another shot rang out, this time shattering a pane of glass in an upstairs window. Shards rained down onto the floorboards. "You're harboring a killer, boy," the voice taunted. "She killed my uncle in cold blood. We've had a warrant on her for 27 years. We're here to serve that justice." "Vengeance, you mean?" Ruth murmured from her position on the floor, her voice laced with contempt. The bounty hunters began to move, dismounting and using the sparse cover of the outbuildings and the fence line to creep closer. They were professionals, not just angry ranchers. They moved with a predatory grace. A muzzle flash bloomed from behind the water trough, and a bullet thudded into the thick wooden wall of the house, right next to Silas's head. He flinched back, splinters stinging his cheek. He raised the Winchester, took a breath to steady his hands, aimed at the last place he saw the flash, and fired. The roar of the rifle inside the confined space was deafening. A yelp of pain from the darkness told him he'd hit something, if not his target. The fight escalated into a chaotic exchange of fire. Muzzle flashes lit up the yard in brief, terrifying strobes. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Silas fired methodically, trying to make every shot count, his mind a whirlwind of terror and rage. Dr. Henley, despite his age, took up the shotgun, guarding the back door, his face a grim mask of determination. Ruth was a silent, watchful presence in the center of the room. She was not cowering. She was observing, her eyes darting from window to window, tracking the movements of their attackers. She had lived a life of passive waiting, and that part of her was now dead. The ghost of the cellar was gone, replaced by a survivor. "They're trying to flank us," she said, her voice cutting through the din. "They're sending a man around towards the barn." Silas peered out the side window and saw she was right. A lone figure was sprinting in a low crouch, heading for the cover of the large barn. If he got there, he'd have a clear line of fire into the back of the house. "I see him," Silas gritted out, trying to draw a bead on the moving target. He fired, but the man was too fast, disappearing behind the corner of the structure. A new sound pierced the night, a splintering of wood from the rear of the house, followed by a grunt of pain from Dr. Henley. Silas's blood ran cold. He scrambled into the kitchen. The doctor was on the floor, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. A bounty hunter stood in the shattered doorway, a pistol in his hand, a cruel grin on his face. Before the man could fire a second shot, Ruth was there. She raised the Colt revolver with both hands, the weapon steady, and fired. The explosion was deafening in the small space. The bounty hunter staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He collapsed backward out of the doorway and was still. There was no time to process it, no time for horror or triumph. 2 of the attackers were now trying to get closer to the front, using the distraction at the back. They were yelling, trying to coordinate. "They're going to burn us out!" Silas yelled, seeing one of them carrying what looked like a lit torch. This was the end game. Trapped in the house, they would be cooked alive. "We have to get to the barn," Silas said, his mind racing. "There's more cover. We can hold them off from there." "The doctor can't move that fast," Ruth said, already tearing strips from a tablecloth to make a pressure bandage for Henley's wound. "We'll have to carry him," Silas said. "It's our only chance." The plan was suicide, and they all knew it. A 50-yard dash across open ground under fire, but staying in the house was certain death. "On my signal," Silas said, reloading the Winchester. "We go out the back." He took a deep breath, looked at his mother, her face smudged with soot, her eyes blazing with a fierce primal light. He saw the 27 years of darkness fall away, burned off by the heat of this moment. They were in this together, at the end of all things. "Now!" he yelled. He kicked open the remains of the back door and laid down covering fire towards the front of the house, trying to keep the main group of hunters pinned down. Ruth and a grimacing Dr. Henley, who was leaning heavily on her, scrambled out into the yard. They were halfway to the barn when a figure emerged from the shadows near the fence. It was Jedediah Hawkins. He raised his rifle, taking careful aim at Ruth. Time seemed to slow down. Silas saw it happening, but he was too far away, his own rifle trained in another direction. He screamed her name, and then, from the side yard, came a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. It was a bray, but not the mournful, defeated sound Pete had been making. This was a war cry, a sound of rage and loyalty pushed beyond its limits. The old burro, who had been a silent witness to the entire siege, charged out of the darkness. He was no longer a thin, grieving animal. He was a projectile of muscle and bone and righteous anger. With his head down and his teeth bared, he slammed headlong into Jedediah Hawkins. The impact was brutal. Hawkins cried out in shock and pain as the full weight of the charging animal knocked him off his feet, his rifle flying from his hands. For a precious few seconds, chaos reigned. Pete, in a frenzy, kicked and bit at the downed man, a loyal sentinel making his final heroic stand. Another bounty hunter, seeing his leader in trouble, turned and fired his pistol twice. The shots were flat, ugly sounds in the night. Pete's charge faltered. He staggered, a pained cry escaping his lips, and then collapsed onto the dusty ground. The heroic sacrifice, however, had bought them the time they needed. The distraction was total. Silas, Ruth, and the wounded doctor scrambled the last few feet into the relative safety of the barn, slamming the heavy wooden door shut just as a hail of bullets hammered into it. They were safe for the moment, but the cost was devastating. Silas looked out through a crack in the boards. He could see Pete's still form lying in the yard, a casualty of a war he shouldn't have had to fight. A wave of grief, so sharp and powerful it almost brought him to his knees, washed over him. That brave, stubborn old burro had done more than guard a secret. He had died for it. The barn was a cavern of shadows, smelling of hay, leather, and manure. It was a better fortress than the house. The thick timber walls could stop a rifle round, and the hayloft offered a superior firing position. But they were still trapped, and their enemies were enraged. "Stay with him," Silas told his mother, gesturing to the pale, sweating Dr. Henley. He climbed the ladder to the hayloft, the Winchester clutched in his hand. From this vantage point, he could see the entire yard. The two remaining bounty hunters, Jedediah Hawkins and one other, had taken cover behind the water trough. The man Ruth had shot was dead in the kitchen doorway. The one Silas had hit earlier was groaning somewhere in the darkness. And Pete was gone. "Give it up, Whitmore!" Hawkins screamed, his voice raw with fury. He had a personal stake in this now. It wasn't just about a decades-old grudge. It was about the humiliation of being attacked by a donkey and the death of his man. "There's nowhere left to run!" Silas didn't answer. He rested the rifle on a bale of hay, took aim, and waited. The waiting was the hardest part. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the hollow ache of loss. Down below, he could hear his mother's low, soothing voice as she tended to the doctor's wound, her words a strange counterpoint to the violent tension outside. The stalemate held for what felt like an eternity. Then, a new, terrifying sound, the flickering, crackling roar of fire. They had succeeded in lighting the torch. Jedediah was making a run for the barn, his face illuminated by the dancing flames, his expression a mask of pure, malevolent hatred. Silas fired. The shot went wide, splintering the corner of the trough. The second hunter laid down suppressing fire, bullets thudding into the barn walls around the hayloft opening, forcing Silas to duck down. This was their tactic. One man provides cover, the other advances with the fire. He was pinned down. He couldn't get a clear shot. In a few seconds, Hawkins would be at the wall, and the whole barn would go up in flames. It was over. But then, something changed below. The main barn door creaked open. Silas looked down in disbelief. It was Ruth. She was standing in the doorway, framed against the dark interior. In her hands, she held his father's old, heavy Winchester, the one that had been mounted on the wall for years. She wasn't holding it like a victim. Her stance was wide, her shoulders set. The woman who had lived in shadows for 27 years was now willingly stepping into the firelight. Hawkins stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening in a mixture of triumph and surprise. "Well, well," he sneered, the torchlight dancing on his face. "The murderess shows herself at last." He took a step forward, raising the torch as if to make a pronouncement. He had what he wanted. He had his uncle's killer, cornered and exposed. His arrogance made him careless. Ruth raised the rifle to her shoulder. She didn't hesitate. She didn't tremble. Her face was calm, resolute, as if all the fear had been burned out of her, leaving only a core of pure, unyielding will. She had lost her husband, her freedom, her son, and her life. She had nothing left to lose and a whole world to reclaim. This man, this embodiment of the hatred that had imprisoned her, was the final lock. She fired. The roar of the heavy-caliber rifle was a sound of finality. It was not a sound of desperation, but of judgment. Jedediah Hawkins was thrown backward, as if struck by an invisible fist, the torch flying from his hand and extinguishing in the dirt. He lay still. The last remaining bounty hunter, seeing his leader fall, broke. He scrambled to his feet, fired one last wild shot into the darkness, and fled, his footsteps pounding away into the night until they were swallowed by the silence. And then there was quiet. A profound, ringing silence broken only by the whimpering of the wounded man and the low, pained groans of Dr. Henley. The battle was over. The siege was broken. In the sudden, shocking stillness, Ruth stood in the doorway, the rifle still held at the ready, wisps of smoke curling from the barrel into the cool night air. She was no longer a ghost, no longer a secret. She was the mistress of the ranch, bathed in the pale moonlight, a warrior who had just bought her own freedom with a storm of righteous fury. The aftermath arrived not with the thunder of hooves, but with the slow, creeping dawn. The sky to the east bruised, then purpled, then bled into a soft, pearlescent gray. The light revealed a scene of brutal stillness. 2 bodies lay in the yard, stark and lifeless against the dew-kissed dirt. A third man, the one Silas had wounded early on, had surrendered, his bravado replaced by whimpering pain from a shattered leg. Inside the barn, Dr. Henley was pale and weak, but alive, his shoulder crudely but effectively bandaged by Ruth. The silence was layered. Beneath the surface-level peace lay the deep, resonant grief for Pete, whose still form under the cottonwood tree was a heart-wrenching testament to loyalty. And beneath that, the quiet hum of shock. The violence had ended, but its echoes remained, etched into the splintered wood of the house and the haunted expressions of the survivors. Silas found his mother by the water trough, washing the blood and grime from her hands and face. The water was cold, and she moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if reacquainting herself with the simple sensations of the world. She looked up as he approached, and her eyes, though shadowed with exhaustion, held a new light. It wasn't triumph, but a kind of profound, weary clarity. The cellar had been a place of waiting. The battle had been a place of doing. This new world, the world of the morning after, was a place of being. "It's over," Silas said, the words feeling inadequate. "No," she replied softly, drying her hands on her skirt. "It's beginning." As the sun climbed higher, Casting long shadows across the yard, Dr. Henley, propped up against a hay bale, called Silas over. His voice was weak, but his eyes were lucid. "In my bag," he rasped. "Inner pocket, an envelope." Silas retrieved it. The envelope was thick, yellowed with age, and sealed with a wax stamp bearing his father's initial, U. It was addressed simply to the law. "Thomas gave that to me over 20 years ago," Dr. Henley explained, his breath catching. "It's his full confession, everything. Why he did it, the proof of Hawkins's attack, my own complicity. He wrote it to protect her in case the truth ever came out. He wanted the blame to fall on him, even in death. He instructed me to turn it over to the authorities if this day ever came." The weight of the letter in Silas's hand was immense. It was the final piece of his father's sacrifice, a legal shield forged from love and foresight. It was a testament that would speak when he no longer could. The sheriff arrived before noon, drawn by the bounty hunter who had fled and spun a wild tale of being ambushed. He arrived with 2 deputies, their guns drawn, expecting to find a den of killers. What they found instead was a scene far more complex. A wounded doctor, a dead bounty hunter in a kitchen, another dead in the yard with a registered bounty on his head, a third tied up and confessing his role in the illegal assault, and a woman who was supposed to have been dead for 27 years. The arrival of the law was not the terrifying climax Silas had always feared it would be. It was a quiet, procedural affair. The sheriff, a reasonable man named Elias Vance, listened. He read Thomas Whitmore's letter, his face growing more grim and thoughtful with every line. He took Dr. Henley's statement. He listened to Ruth's account, delivered in a clear, unwavering voice that held the authority of truth. He looked at the evidence, the fortified cellar, the fresh wanted posters offering a private bounty, the signs of a siege rather than an arrest. The law, which had once been the thing his father feared most, became, in the end, their salvation. The narrative of a murderous woman in hiding was replaced by the truth, a family under attack, defending their home against a violent, extrajudicial vendetta. Ruth was officially exonerated, her act of killing Caleb Hawkins deemed a clear case of self-defense, and Thomas's actions, while illegal, were viewed with a reluctant, unspoken understanding. The dead bounty hunters were seen as casualties of their own aggression. Justice, it turned out, was not as blind as Thomas had feared. It was merely slow, and it needed to be shown the way. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet mending. The physical scars on the ranch were the first to heal. Silas replaced the shattered windows and patched the bullet holes in the walls. The bloodstains were scrubbed from the floorboards, but the deeper wounds remained. They buried Pete under the cottonwood tree, placing a simple, smooth river stone to mark his grave. Silas and Ruth often stood there in the evenings, not speaking, sharing a silent gratitude for the small, stubborn creature who had been the story's first and most noble hero. Dr. Henley recovered, his arm healing slowly, and he became a regular visitor, no longer a keeper of secrets, but simply a friend, sharing coffee on the porch and marveling at the strange, hard-won peace that had settled over the Whitmore ranch. For Ruth, the world was a continuous act of discovery. Sunlight was a miracle. The taste of fresh-picked berries was a revelation. The vast, open expanse of the prairie sky was an intoxicating freedom. She walked the land, her bare feet pressing into the soil, reclaiming the territory of her life one step at a time. She learned the names of the wildflowers that grew by the creek and the calls of the birds that nested in the eaves of the barn. Her skin, once ghostly pale, slowly took on the golden hue of the sun. The gray in her hair seemed to shine, no longer a mark of confinement, but a crown of survival. One crisp autumn morning, Silas found her standing before the open cellar. The green door, the object that had defined both their lives, was gone. He had taken it off its hinges a week prior at her request. The 3 ancient locks now sat on the mantelpiece, inert and harmless, relics of a past that no longer held any power. "I'm going to fill it with preserves for the winter," she said. her voice carrying the simple, declarative power of a woman in charge of her own life. And potatoes. And carrots. She was turning the tomb into a root cellar. She was transforming the symbol of her imprisonment into a place of nourishment and simple domestic purpose. It was the ultimate act of reclamation. That evening they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was a breathtaking canvas of fire and gold. A cool breeze whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. For a long time neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer a void of secrets and sorrow. It was a comfortable, shared space, built from the splinters of a broken past and scarred by the memory of sacrifice. It was the quiet of home. Ruth reached over and placed her hand on his. Her skin was warm, weathered by the sun, the hand of a rancher, a survivor, a mother. "He would have liked this," she said softly, her gaze on the horizon, where the last sliver of sun was disappearing. "Your father. He loved the sunsets." Silas looked at his mother, at the strength etched into the lines around her eyes, at the quiet peace that had finally settled in her soul. He thought of his father's immense, silent love, of Pete's unwavering loyalty, of the terrible, beautiful, and complicated truth that now formed the foundation of their lives. The cost had been immense. The grief was a permanent resident in his heart. But looking at his mother, free and whole in the fading light, he knew that peace had been earned. Justice had been made, not found. And home, he was beginning to understand, was not a place you were given, but a place you built, fought for, and rebuilt. One splinter and one scar at a time, until it was finally truly yours.